Welcome to Whisky Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 965 for August 14th, 2022. Coming up in a few minutes.
It was just full of really good information that kind of gave you a snapshot as to who at the time was buying and transferring shares in such a large company as Johnnie Walker. And it was from everywhere. It wasn't just from, Edinburgh, or it wasn't just from Scotland. It was London, it was Southampton, it was Lincolnshire, it was Essex, it was everywhere you could imagine.
There's all sorts of whiskey history out there in attics, old filing cabinets, and even on eBay. That's where Andrew Welford found an old John Walker & Sons shares ledger from 1944. He bought it for £100 and took it to Whisky.auction, where Isabel Graham Yule recognized the significance of that ledger. Instead of selling it, the two of them did the unexpected. They contacted the Diageo Corporate Archives and donated it. I'll talk with Andrew Welford and Isabel Graham Yule later on WhiskyCast in depth. We also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Gabriel Cardarella here with Dewar's Whiskey, inviting you to enjoy this episode of WhiskyCast with a glass of Dewar's, the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in history.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Hiya, Mark. How's my favourite Redbreast fan doing? Look, I'm going to address the elephant in the room right away. We both know your podcast is dying for a co-host, and I know just the lad who can be the Robin to your Batman. How's that for dropping a hint?
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast, Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Bidding is underway in the Kentucky Bourbon Benefit Auction to raise money for Eastern Kentucky flooding victims. The online auction opened on Thursday and will run through the 21st. We have a link in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. As of now, the high bid is $133,850 for a Four Roses private barrel selection and experience with master distiller Brent Elliott. Other high bids include a Willet 10-year-old barrel selection. The bid on that is $70,000. There are also barrel picks available from Wild Turkey, Elijah Craig, Wilderness Trail, and other distilleries. All of the money raised from the auction will be donated to the state of Kentucky's official Eastern Kentucky Disaster Relief Fund. We're less than a month away from the annual release of Old Forester's Birthday Bourbon, but this year's release will be a bit different. Instead of selling the 2022 Birthday Bourbon primarily at the distillery in Louisville and a handful of retailers, Brown-Forman plans to hold a nationwide lottery for the highly prized bottles. Details are still to be announced, but the people who subscribe to Old Forester's email updates will get the first word. Pittsburgh's Wiggle Whiskey Distillery and its sister cidery are being sold. The Meyer-Grelly family is selling the company to Pittsburgh Spirits. It's controlled by Bob Nutting, the majority owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates baseball team. Meredith Meyer-Grelly said the sale would allow Wiggle and Threadbare Cider and Need to both keep growing for the future, and that she and her family had taken them as far as they could. Inflation is dominating the headlines these days, and yes, whiskey prices are rising along with the cost of almost everything, and that is starting to show a bit in spirits sales. Beam Suntory this week reported a 13% increase in sales worldwide during the first 6 months of this year, with strong growth in the U.S., Australia, and India. However, CEO Albert Bellotti told CNBC that the company is now starting to see, quote, a little bit of tempering in its high-end categories as some consumers start opting for lower-priced spirits. I almost hesitate to mention this last story, since I've always maintained that whiskey is for drinking, not for investing. But the online investment platform Rally plans to start offering shares in Pappy Van Winkle beginning Tuesday. Not the company, but 6 bottles of Pappy. They're planning to sell 2,000 shares in those 6 bottles, starting at $7 each. The investors will not get a drop of the whiskey, but theoretically could profit once the bottles are sold. It's another sign of the apocalypse, gang. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from Whiskey Cast.
Time now for the Whiskey Cast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville hosts an Angel's Envy bourbon dinner this Wednesday night. McTears has its next auction of rare whiskeys on Friday in Glasgow, Scotland. Spirits Vogtland is Friday and Saturday in Gries, Germany. Sagamore Spirits' next Whiskey on the Waterfront party is on Saturday in Baltimore. The Bourbon Women's Annual Symposium Conference is August 25th through the 28th in Louisville, and the Spirit of Alba Whiskey and Gin Festival is on the 27th at Kirkintilloch Town Hall in Glasgow. Finally, Whiskey Live Adelaide is September 2nd and 3rd in Adelaide, Australia. Our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com lets you look for events in your area or wherever you may be traveling. It's brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the new buyvirginiarye.com site for more details, and please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. 2 homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Whiskey Cast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. Back in the day, most distillery owners didn't hang on to a lot of their history, liquid or documentary. They held on to records for as long as the law required, or until they ran out of space, then threw them in the rubbish bin. A lot of those documents remain, though. Accountants held on to them, or someone else thought they might be useful to someone someday. Many of them formed the backbone of corporate archives at companies like Diageo, John Dewar & Sons, Irish Distillers, and the like. Sometimes, though, those documents wind up in an attic or someone's old filing cabinet, waiting for their descendants to uncover them. That is what happened with a 1944 share ledger from John Walker & Sons, outlining 500 different share transfers at the peak of World War II, many from widows and widowers who may well have lost their loved ones during the war. Andrew Welford came across the ledger in a most unusual place and recognized its significance. Andrew, I'd like you to tell me the story of how you found this, what you were looking for, and tell me about this book.
So I'm always just looking for any sort of history that I can find that links to whiskey distilleries in Scotland. And of all places, eBay, I like to have a flick through and see what I can find. And sometimes it could just be invoices from distilleries. It could be postcards, sales receipts, anything, any paper documents that really tell the story of Scotch whisky, even from the 1800s, 1900s, whenever, but just to get a snapshot of history. And there it was on eBay, and I wasn't exactly sure what it was. Really, the description was a little bit bare, but bought it. I seem to remember it was £130 they were looking for, but I ended up paying £100. It was quite cheeky, but got it for £100. And it was actually on Christmas Eve I bought it. It was a quiet Christmas Eve, flicking through eBay, and then it arrived just after Christmas. And the thing that really caught my attention, first of all, it was quite a large book, and it had a lovely ornate cover of reds and greens. So bought it, arrived, and basically it was just full of 500 transfers of shares from one person to another, primarily dated, I think it was 1944. Most of the shares were being transferred, but even that was quite interesting because it had not only the names of people who were transferring the shares, where they were from, what their occupation was, which was really interesting. World War II, there was lots of widowers listed in there as well, which obviously we wouldn't really see now as an occupation. But it was just full of really good information that kind of gave you a snapshot as to who at the time was buying and transferring shares in such a large company as Johnnie Walker. And it was from everywhere. It wasn't just from, Edinburgh, or it wasn't just from Scotland. It was London, it was Southampton, it was Lincolnshire, it was Essex, it was everywhere you could imagine people who were buying the shares. It just provided such a good snapshot. And I had a good flick through it. I mean, there's lots and lots of documents in there, so many to go through, but each one was kind of a unique record of somebody who is obviously may or not be here anymore, but provided a snapshot not only into their life, but also the life of Johnnie Walker as well.
I'm stunned that this would have made it out into the public domain to begin with, let alone wind up on eBay of all places. What did you think when you finally realized what you had here?
It was one of those things that you felt had some significance, and if I could pass it on to somebody who would get something out of it, whether that was family research or more history on Johnnie Walker during World War II, as long as somebody enjoyed it and appreciated it for what it was, that was what I was kind of looking for. I enjoyed it, and it just felt nice to kind of pass it on in the hope that one day somebody somewhere takes that and can find out something really important, potentially, something that may be missed as well. It was it felt strange that it was out in the public domain, but lots of things from distilleries do get out into the public domain, I suppose. They're no longer needed. Diageo obviously have a really big archive and they can store lots and lots of documents. But I suppose some distilleries will just naturally dispose of documents, I suppose, that they don't need anymore or they don't feel are of significance. But I think there's so much out there waiting to be discovered, even in people's homes that they've kind of stored. Potentially somebody's worked at a distillery and picked something up and then it's just kicking around. There's so much history and these documents are out there, I think, just waiting to be kind of rediscovered to help form that picture of how whiskey developed over time.
Sort of an Ancestry.com for the whiskey business.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what it was. Going through it, there was so much information, yeah.
We're joined now by Isabel Graham-Ewell of Whisky.auction. And what did you think, Isabel, when you saw this book?
It's an extraordinary book. And what's so special about it is it's not something that we'd seen before. I think at this stage in my career, it's a lot of things we've seen before, and something like this we hadn't. And I think Andrew is a bit of a truffle hunter for special whiskey books. It takes a whiskey enthusiast, but also a sort of truffle hunting, a whiskey history hunting enthusiast to find these sort of things. What's interesting about it, I think, is that it's not. But it's a big name. So John Walker, it naturally it's of great interest. But the information within the book is not. There's nothing there that you can write. It's not the basis for a great expose or greater insight for the industry or for an enthusiast. It's a nice thing to hold, and it's a beautiful thing to hold. And that was why I contacted Andrew, and I sort of. It struck me that this was exactly the sort of thing that the archive would be either missing. I think when I contacted Andrew, I was imagining that they had the entire set of them and there was a gap on the shelf, just the right size for this one. It later transpired that they didn't have any of them. So this is huge for them. And this is something that they're getting insights into sort of certain very small window of financial records of I think the share certificate. So, and that's as far as my knowledge goes on these. The share certificate, I mean, we looked at them in great depth, but really it needs a sort of a financial historian to really get to the bottom of it, and also to find out what the relevance is. I mean, that's, I suppose, why there's an archive. It's not a question of what's the relevance. It's, well, we'll keep it somewhere safe until we find a reason to need it, I suppose. And that's what's so wonderful. I mean, when Andrew and I went to the archive together, and he sort of did a ceremonial handing over, and that was, you know, and the excitement of Christine McCafferty as she opened this thing that she had not seen before was wonderful. I mean, it was just and Andrew's excitement at taking it to its home, I suppose.
Because that's really where something like this belongs, is in a company archive, right? Now,
this is a great philosophical debate. I mean, we how many hours have you got for this chat, Mark?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, Andrew was looking at it and seeing it as a whiskey enthusiast. It belonged to him. I mean, and why not? And as an auction, we sort of feel it belongs to us to sell. I mean, but sometimes you just look at something and go, well, this could gather very little interest or a lot of interest, but whoever wins it it'll just sort of disappear into somebody's personal library, or be broken down into individual sheets. And I don't know, and that was why, you know, for us, there's potential there for there to be. Now, who knows? There might be something superbly interesting, and I think Andrew did exactly the same thing as I did. You start looking for names you might recognise, but it's, you know, we're not there to. This is not what we're able to do. We don't have this information to hand, so it's exciting to know that potentially it's going to be used in that way. Now, where it belongs, where its home is. I mean, I think we all believe it is its home, and I'm sure the archive feel that. But then, you know, I think when we went there, I asked, well, why don't you have a copy of this? And that's, well, they wouldn't have known necessarily that this would be of interest 80 years later. So at what point do you decide who owns whiskey history? And that's why I think it's a really interesting story, because Andrew didn't come with this opinion when he brought it to us. He was saying, look at this amazing thing. I think I've bought something that might be quite valuable, and rightly so. And isn't this interesting? I love whiskey. I love whiskey history. It's not that that's wrong. I think he's right. I think it doesn't. I don't think it does belong to the archive. I think it feels right that the archive should have it. But that's different. I mean, it's.
That's what I'm saying. It feels right. That's the right place for it, where it can be preserved.
Yeah, I think so, and we can all go there. But this is, you know, we went along and looked at the other books that they've got in the archive, and it would be heartbreaking to know that they were scattered around, and, you know, people were cutting them up to make nice pictures out of them. Also, it's. There are things there that are potentially very interesting for the future. So it feels like it's back home. It's like Andrew found a sort of a lost puppy and brought it to the the dog home, and we were able to reunite it with its owner, who hadn't noticed the puppy was missing. When there's an analogy for you.
Andrew, what's your take on this?
I think it would be incredible if, obviously, that's the only one they've got. And as you said, you know, I imagined as well one to be missing. But to know that, again, there are potentially other versions of this out there, potentially even earlier in time. I seem to remember that this is only 500 transfers of shares in this one book, and it was quite a substantial book. So to know there's others out there, I think it would be incredible if from this as well as an added bonus, others appeared and, kind of added to that history, I think is fantastic. And I like, I like your analogy of Truffle Hunter as well. That's a good one. Always searching for that nugget of gold, yes.
And there's a lot of this stuff out there, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, there's so much whiskey history that's squirreled away in people's homes that they just don't even realize what they've got, whether that's it's an invoice, it's a postcard, it's a sales receipt from a distillery. It all kind of can come together to form this picture of a distillery and how a particular distillery might have changed over time. Distilleries should be interested in this stuff as well. I mean, they've got visitor centres now, and they spend a lot of money on visitor centres, and to fill them with artefacts that kind of show the history as well. I think, it's something they should be trying to do to preserve that.
And I think that's quite what's wonderful about the Diageo Archive. Obviously, they're big. They can do this. Not everyone is in a financial position to build a huge archive in the way that they have. But it doesn't need to be on that scale. And what's surprising is how many distilleries really aren't. They'll talk about the heritage, the history, but when it comes down to something like this, they're not that interested. And it's surprising quite often when they're not interested. You think, like, look what we found, and they're like, oh, we're not interested. What? Really? Why? So this was just perfect. This was lovely. It was just really nice, and that sort of it's nice to have someone like Andrew who really gets it, who understands the whiskey. It's a drink, but it's also more than that, isn't it?
And to even get the chance to look around the archive, that was well worth it. It was fantastic. It was a treasure trove, really. It was incredible.
It seems like distilleries are more interested in maintaining liquid archives than they are document archives.
But even that's recent. I mean, I think a lot of the distilleries are having to fill in gaps in their archives, and it's. I think you'd be surprised how little they've had in their archives in the past. I think with the sort of democratization of auctions now, with the internet and being able to find things, it has made there be a greater interest in those past bottlings. I think when I used to go to distilleries, I'd have possibly 3 or 4, and this is what it used to look like, and it was all about the now. What can you buy now? What can we show you that we're doing to make you want to buy more now? And it's I think it has changed a lot just in the last 5 years. So what we're finding as an auction is some of the bottles that we're finding through people like Andrew and other people, collections that have been in private collections and bottles stuck at the back of people's cupboards. It's very often the distilleries that are trying to trace their history back. And it's not just the bottles themselves, it's the flavor profiles. You might be saying to your branding team and your customers that nothing has changed and the flavor is exactly the same as it ever was. Well, they sometimes open the bottle to test that out.
Isabel, what might this book have gone for if it had gone on auction?
Do you know, I mean, who knows? Andrew, cover your ears. This is a private conversation between me and Mark. I don't know. And we did talk about this. So I think Andrew was, we discussed it before even speaking to the archive, because it's possible that it would have gone for a lot. It's possible that people wouldn't understand it, and it's look, nice old looking paper, we're finding in our auction that there is a huge demand for relevant historical records, but also, I'd argue, irrelevant historical records that just look and feel lovely. But you do get anomalies sometimes. So sometimes things go for thousands, and sometimes people pick things up for a song. And I think I suppose that's where the clever truffle hunters do well, I suppose.
I think you're right, though. I mean, it's one of those things. If it went to auction, I think it was credit to you, because you could have easily said, let's put it into auction, and let's let's just go for it. But I think we were more invested and interested in the history of it and finding that home. And I think you're right, it could have gone for, what I paid for it, £100, if that. Likewise, I'm sure somebody would have been willing to pay an awful lot of money for it. But I think at the end of the day, to know that it's there, and if something good comes out of it, I think that's worth it. I think.
Yeah, and I think when I approached Andrew with the and it was with some trepidation, because you don't know, we hadn't spoken really before that, and it was a sort of a meeting of minds. I think we both felt very strongly that this was a truly sort of lovely thing to do and the right thing to do, and it felt great, and it was just that, it was a nice day out. So
it was. Thank you for arranging it.
So I have to ask, was it worth £100?
Oh yeah, I mean, when else do you get to go to Diageo's archive and get to walk around it and get to experience this? It was well worth it, absolutely. Still doing it, still finding things. I'm sure, hopefully, find some other things as well in the future.
Thanks to Andrew Welford and Isabel Graham-Ewell for joining us on this week's Whiskey Cast In Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Had the chance to taste Bruichladdich fall releases this week, including the latest Port Charlotte Cask Exploration Series bottling. SC01 is made from 100% Islay barley and matured for 9 years in a combination of ex-sherry, ex-bourbon, and finally Sauterne wine casks. The nose has a gentle smokiness, along with touches of grilled pineapple, cooked banana, dried flowers, and apricots. The taste is thick, oily, and smoky with notes of grilled citrus, banana, dried flowers, and a touch of green grapes that gives it a slightly tart and astringent mouthfeel. The finish has a good balance of smoke and fruity character, and I'm scoring the Port Charlotte SC01 a 94. That one is available now, along with the latest Bruichladdich Islay barley release. The 2013 edition comes from barley grown on the island in 2012, and it's bottled at 50% ABV. The nose is grassy and tart with touches of lemongrass, straw, lemon zest, dried flowers, and honey. The taste is honey thick and sweet with a citrusy tartness that builds up slowly, along with hints of heather, lemongrass, and dried flowers. The finish is long, fruity, and floral with a subtle touch of tartness, and I'm scoring the Bruichladdich Islay Barley 2013 single malt a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. You can find their signature Double Oak, Cask Strength, or Reserve Series ryes, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Just visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly. Now, this year's Black Art release won't be available until October, but I got to taste it early. It's the 10th edition of Black Art and the 6th for head distiller Adam Hennett, who's the only person that knows the cask profile that goes into Black Art. We do know that it is a 29-year-old single malt and that the nose has hints of fresh berries, ripe tree fruits, toasted oak, apricots, and honey. The taste is thick and oily with notes of orange, barley sugar, apricots, toasted oak, and honey, while the finish is long, fruity, and vibrant. I say this almost every year, but this year's edition may be Adam's best yet. I'm scoring the Bruichladdich Black Art 10 a 96. Finally, we had Reservoir Distillery's Shelley Sakier on the show last month to talk about her new book, Make It a Double. She sent along a sample of Reservoir's Hunter and Scott bourbon, which blends Reservoir's own bourbon, along with bourbons from Kentucky and Indiana. It's a 4-grain whiskey bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has hints of caramel, molasses, toasted oak, subtle spices, and hints of tobacco and leather. The taste starts off with chocolate and subtle spices that linger in the background, along with honey, vanilla, and hints of tobacco, leather, and caramel. The spices take over on the finish and last for a long time, with hints of toasted oak and caramel in the background. I'm scoring the Hunter and Scott bourbon a 92. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of more than 3,300 different whiskeys from all over the world. You can search by a whiskey's name, country, style, or even the score I gave it. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Dewar's master blender Stephanie McLeod's innate curiosity, combined with her passion for whiskey maturation, cask finishing, and blending, has created some truly incredible expressions for Dewar's Scotch whiskey. It's also earned her 4 consecutive Master Blender of the Year titles at the International Whiskey Competition, making her the first person to achieve such an accolade. Her innovative spirit is the inspiration behind the ultra-premium Dewar's Double Double 32 Year, the highest-rated blended Scotch whiskey in the world with a score of 94.4. So whether you consider yourself a whiskey connoisseur or just want to find an exciting new whiskey experience, consider one of Stephanie's other masterful expressions, including Dewar's 15-year, Double Double 21-year, or Dewar's 8-year Mizunara cask finish, and discover just how rewarding curiosity can be. Enjoy responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Scarabus Islay Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Last time around, I read a tweet from Bobby Tanzilo in Milwaukee asking about whiskey companies reducing the amount of packaging they use to eliminate waste. And I have an update on that this week after meeting with the Bruichladdich team in New York the other day. They've been giving distillery visitors the option of buying bottles without canisters for a while now, but plans are in the works to start phasing out canisters on their Port Charlotte releases over the next few months, mostly after the beginning of 2023. There's been no decision yet on whether to expand that to the Bruichladdich and Octomore releases. Our friends at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society's Canadian chapter decided to pull my chain this week. They tweeted a photo of the weather forecast for Calgary showing temperatures in the 30s Celsius, along with one of their bottles and this note: "When it's damn hot and you want to have a whiskey, adding ice is called for, despite the inevitable wrath of WhiskyCast. And wow, is this delicious. #SMWS. Inevitable wrath? Oh, please. I may not like ice in my whiskeys, but when it's that hot outside, go for it if that's what you like. In fact, that advice applies all year round. Drink your whiskeys the way you like them. I won't judge. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find me on social media. Just look for WhiskyCast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Scarabus, the Islay single malt from Hunter Lang & Company that celebrates all of Islay's natural gifts in one bottle. Only those who seek shall find Scarabus. Start your search at hunterlang.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Last time around, I mentioned Arcane Distilling's Alpha Whiskey made from a fully hopped IPA beer. And I had a listener request to take a closer look at the still Arcane uses, because it's one of the few vacuum stills being used in whiskey production today. I talked with Arcane's Phil Morgan, and I gotta be honest here, a truly detailed podcast explanation of how his still works would take far more time than we have, and probably leave many of us confused. It's really the type of thing that takes a video to explain, and we'll work on that in the next few weeks. Essentially, though, almost all of the air is removed from the system during distillation, and Phil Morgan compares it to a sous vide cooking system.
So people that are into cuisine, thinking about sous vide, vacuum distillation, when you pull a vacuum, pull the air out, everything boils at a really low temperature. So because it boils at a really low temperature, you're able to save all the flavors and aromas that in a normal distillation system you would lose in that process because you're cooking it, and also it's evaporating into the atmosphere because you can't collect 100% of everything off a standard distillation system.
Vacuum stills aren't new. Penderyn in Wales has been using a unique Faraday still since it opened that uses a vacuum, and William Grant & Sons pioneered the technique back in the 1960s at its Girvan distillery in Scotland. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course a complete archive of all of our past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
People never forget the person who introduced them to Redbreast. And then those people go on to introduce others to Redbreast, and soon the flock has grown exponentially. It's like a pyramid scheme. Without any of the bad stuff, of course.
Proud sponsor of WhiskeyCast.
Well, folks, we're nearing the end of another great episode of WhiskeyCast, which means you're probably craving some whiskey. Head on over to Dewar's.com or your local retailer to discover what makes Dewar's the most awarded blended Scotch whiskey in the world.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2022, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.